So let's make sure that you have the correct answers and you have the right ideas, so you can get this in your mind before the test. And then if you have anything that you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, or I want to ask about that, highlight it, circle it, put a star by it, do something so that when we come together as a class, you can ask questions that are valuable before the test, or ask me to talk more about one thing or the other before the test. So we're going to start at the top with Patterns in Biology Study Guide. Our first term is evolution. The definition is the theory based on the idea that all species are related and gradually change over time. This is really important here, this over time piece. This doesn't just happen overnight. You and I can't just like decide to grow fur or decide to grow long fangs or decide to change. This happens generation after generation after generation after generation, right? It takes a long time. All right. The next term is fossil. The definition is the preserved remains or traces of remains of ancient organisms. Trace fossil are the geological records of biological activity. The fossil record is the history of life as documented by fossils. And embryology is the study of the embryo. All right, so what is an embryo? An embryo is the early developmental stage of a multicellular organism. So it's developing an organism. Natural selection is the process through which populations of living organisms adapt and change. Trait is an inherited characteristic that appears in offspring, and adaptation is the process by which a species becomes fitted to its environment. And you were supposed to fill in the blanks. These all came from learning targets. If you were unable to fill in these blanks without a little extra help, I feel like you need to go back and study your notebook a little bit longer. That would definitely benefit you. So I can use math to support how natural selection affects individual probabilities of survival. I understand that natural selection may lead to increases and decreases of specific traits over time. I can identify similar body structures of organisms in multiple species in the early stages of development. I can analyze anatomical data to identify patterns that infer relationships of species using comparative embryology. I can use rock layers to figure out information about geologic time and understand how scientists have figured out where and when different organisms existed. All right, I'm going to pause it. Do you have any questions about this page? Please make sure you ask now. All right. I can analyze pictorial data and identify patterns in the fossil record. I can explain how it's possible for scientists to study animals or plants that existed millions of years ago. I can compare modern and fossil organisms to infer anatomic evolutionary relationships. Guys, these are really long words. If you are struggling to keep up with this, remember you can pause the video, you can look in your notebook, you can use your learning targets document to help you. All right, so you should be able to answer these questions. Of course, I will give you multiple choice questions, but some I might actually ask you to respond or fill in the blank. So the first question is, how is it possible to study fossil evidence of an animal or plant that no longer exists? You might remember the lesson where we had the puzzle pieces and we just kind of knew how to fit them together because of things we already knew. We could recognize patterns and shapes and lines and sizes, right? Well, scientists use fossils and trace fossils to compare what they know about modern organisms, and then they make inferences. Remember, an inference is an educated guess, right? Number 2, what is the difference between a fossil and a trace fossil? So a fossil can show actual remains of an organism, but trace fossils are evidence for behavior or about their behavior because they're like footprints or impressions in the soil. Number 3, what pictorial data do scientists use to infer what has happened over time to body structures and sizes of organisms? So the use of the fossil record, that's what they use. They use the fossil record, and it indicates that life has actually become larger and more complex over time. There are things that have become smaller in size, but since the very beginning, if you look from individual, single, unicellular organisms, then it goes to multicellular organisms, and then more complex organisms over time. Now, dinosaurs were huge. They no longer exist, but we still have huge things like whales. Okay. Number 4, use the rock layers below to answer the questions. So you had to look at the rock layers, and the oldest fossils are A and B. So that's this fossil and this fossil. Remember, the farther down the rock layer, the older it is. So which fossils are the most recent? It's B and C. So B is the swirly and C is this. So these are the most recent from this layer. The fossil that came into existence in layer C, so in layer 2. So there were only 2 fossils in layer 1, and now there are 3. So this fossil C, came into existence in layer 2. And the fossil that became extinct after layer 3, so you no longer see this fossil after layer 3, is fossil A. Okay? Any questions about this page? All right. Last page, but it has the longest answers and probably took the most thinking on your part. It says, number 5, there are many embryos of different species that share the same body structures in early development. What have scientists inferred about this evidence? Well, scientists think, actually they know, that it's possible, right, possibility, that they all share a common ancestor that may have changed over time. So number 6 says, what are some of the similar body structures that scientists have used to identify patterns involved with embryology? So they have figured out that all embryos have eyes or backbones, tails, and the head structure, and that's a really common body structure for them to have in their anatomy. Here's one we didn't actually look at in class, but we did talk about some of these series. So, excuse me, my goodness. Use the pictures below to answer the questions. These are clearly the feet of different birds, like different foot design of different types of birds. I asked you to name 3 similarities shared by the bird foot structures pictured above. Now, there could be more than what I just listed, but they all have these thin leg bones. So birds that fly, right, they have light bones. So they're all skinny kind of leg bones. Or the claws and talons, every one has some form of claw or talons. And they'll have relatively long toes, probably to help them with balance, right? The next question says, what can you infer, remember that means guess, about the habitat of a bird, A, by looking at the structure of its feet? So here's bird A, and look at the structure of its feet. It's much different than the rest of them. Not too much different than B, but much different. So what can you tell about its habitat? Well, this goes back to what we started learning at the very first few weeks of school. And so bird A has webbed toes. So it probably lived in or near or around water, right? So it can swim. And that's why it has webbed toes, right? And the bird with the most webbed toes or can swim the fastest can catch the most food or can get away from the most predators. And so there we have webbed feet, okay, webbed toes. So it really is important that you put something about it being around water, okay, or living near water or in the water, okay? The next question I wanted you to think about is, what can you infer about the feeding habits of bird D, E, and F by their feet? So D, E, and F, these feet all have really long claws. So what can you tell me about maybe what they eat? Do you think these are the feet of birds that eat berries and seeds, or what can you infer? You don't know a whole lot about them, but they probably eat other consumers, like probably carnivores, so they can grab and hold prey. So they all have really long claws, so they can either grab and hold prey. You know, another possibility might be that they are climbers and they need those extra long claws to get up a tree. But I really specifically asked about feeding habits, right? So they probably eat things that are living and tricky to get to and that they need to hold still while they're chowing down, right? Okay, what can you predict might happen to bird F? Okay, so let's look at bird F, okay? If the talons became infected and became dull, include offspring in your prediction. Well, if this bird is using its talons to hold onto its predators and the talons are damaged or whatever, this bird's going to die of starvation because it's not going to be able to hold its prey still and or, you know, climb to higher places. And so it'll probably not survive long enough to produce offspring If it already has offspring and something happens to its claws, probably it will not be able to feed the offspring, which will not end up surviving, right? So that means that it won't be able to pass whatever traits it has that are beneficial to its life to its offspring, okay? So I pretty much wrote that. It's just like long answer. Okay, let's look at the last thing that I asked you to think about. Number 8, ostriches have the biggest eyes of any land mammal. Cool, huh? Almost 5 centimeters across, and 3 sets of eyelids. The size of their eyes helps them to easily see predators like lions from a long distance. As ostriches can't fly, when threatened, they'll run and can reach speeds up to about 70 kilometers per hour, 43 miles per hour, covering up to 5 meters in a single stride. Their powerful long legs can be formidable weapons, capable of killing a human or a potential predator with a forward kick, right? So don't approach an ostrich from the front because it can kick forward with those amazingly super ultra strong legs with a forward kick. Note to self when you go hang out with your ostrich pets. All right. So I asked you to think, compare 2 ostriches, one with longer legs than the other. Which one has a higher probability of survival and why? Well, I thought that the one with the longer legs would survive better so that it can defend itself, right? So kick farther away and escape predation, which means like run faster from a predator, long enough to keep it alive, long enough to produce offspring, right? And then it will pass its long legs down to the offspring. Because, when you see a bear and you're with somebody, they say don't run, but, as long as you can run faster than the other person, you're going to be okay. So I think maybe the same with ostriches. As long as that ostrich can run faster than the ostrich with smaller legs or shorter legs, that ostrich with the long legs is going to be okay. All right. Make sure you ask any questions that you have before the test.